October 16th, a date that echoes across centuries, carrying with it revolutions, discoveries, courage, and chaos. From the fall of a queen and the birth of Anesthesia, to the rise of empires, protests for justice, and the spark of nuclear fire, every October 16th has changed the world, in ways both beautiful and terrifying. Tonight, we travel through time, from the guillotine to the atomic age, from the sound of freedom to the silence of power, with 10 shocking events in the history. This is the story of October 16th in history, and you're watching Sleeping Historian. Number 1. Marie Antoinette executed, 1793, the fall of a queen. October 16th, 1793, Paris stands still. The revolution, once a whisper of freedom, now roars with fury. A wooden cart creaks through the streets, flanked by soldiers and jeering crowds. Inside it sits a woman who was once the most powerful figure in France, Marie Antoinette, the queen, stripped of her crown, her title, her dignity. She is pale, calm, almost ghost-like. Her once silken gown replaced by plain white cloth. Her golden hair cut short, a final insult before the blade. The people chant her name not with reverence, but rage. Down with the tyrant. They cry, their voices echoing through the city she once ruled. And yet, behind those cries of hatred lies something deeper, the echo of centuries of injustice, of hunger, of power hoarded by the few. To understand this moment, we must go back to the glittering halls of Versailles, a palace so grand it felt like another world. Gold-draped ceilings, endless mirrors, lavish feasts while peasants starved in the streets below. Marie Antoinette was just 14 when she left Austria to marry Louis XVI, a union meant to strengthen alliances, not hearts. She was beautiful, foreign, and utterly unprepared for the scrutiny awaiting her. At court, every move was dissected, every word whispered through the corridors of power. But the outside world, the real France, was falling apart. Bread was scarce, taxes unbearable, and the glitter of Versailles became a symbol of all that was wrong. By the time revolution came in 1789, it wasn't just a rebellion, it was vengeance. The monarchy tried to flee. The royal family was caught. Louis XVI was executed in January 1793. And now, it was the Queen's turn. Her trial was swift, brutal, and decided long before it began. She was accused of conspiring with foreign powers, of draining France's wealth, even of crimes so vile they were never meant to be believed, only to justify her death. Yet, witnesses described her final days not with arrogance, but grace. She refused to weep, refused to beg. When her guards mocked her, she bowed her head in silence. When her accusers spat her name, she stood tall. At 12:15 p.m., October 16th, 1793, Marie Antoinette was brought to the guillotine in the Place de la Révolution. She stepped from the cart, stumbled slightly, and whispered an apology to her executioner for stepping on his foot. Her final words. Moments later, the blade fell, and with it, centuries of monarchy came crashing down. To some, she was a symbol of oppression, a queen who danced while her people starved. To others, she was a victim of chaos, a young woman consumed by forces beyond her control. History, as always, walks between those two truths. But one thing is certain, her death marked the end of an era and the beginning of a new world, built not by kings, but by revolution. And so, as the sun set over Paris that evening, France was forever changed. Royalty had fallen, the people had spoken, but freedom would come at a cost far greater than anyone could imagine. Number 2. John Brown's raid on Harpers Ferry, 1859, the spark that lit the Civil War. October 16, 1859. A chill grips the air in Harpers Ferry, Virginia. While most of the town sleeps, a man with burning eyes and a heart of fire stands ready to make history, or die trying. His name is John Brown. A devout abolitionist, a man who believed slavery was not just an evil, but the sin that poisoned the soul of America. And on this night, he will attempt what no one before him dared to do, ignite a war to end it. Brown wasn't a soldier. He wasn't a politician. He was a farmer, a father of 20 children, and a man convinced that God himself had chosen him to destroy slavery. For years, he had watched as the nation tore itself apart, new states entering the Union, each one debating whether it would be free or slave. Congress fought. Newspapers screamed. Families divided. But still the chains rattled. Still, the human auction continued. To John Brown, enough was enough. That night, Brown and a group of just 21 men, white and black, young and old, marched toward the federal arsenal at Harpers Ferry. Their plan was daring, maybe even delusional. They would seize the armory, distribute weapons to enslaved people, and start a rebellion that would sweep across the South. A revolution of freedom. But fate, as it often does, had other plans. At first, everything went right. The armory was taken with little resistance. Telegraph wires were cut, bridges secured. But as dawn broke, the element of surprise vanished. News spread fast. Militia groups surrounded the town. Trains were halted. Shots echoed through the valley. By morning, Brown and his men were trapped inside a small engine house, a brick building that would forever be known as John Brown's Fort. Inside, the wounded moaned. Gunfire shattered the walls. The dream of liberation began to crumble. Civilians taken hostage pleaded for their lives. And yet Brown refused to surrender. For 2 days, the standoff raged. The U.S. Marines, commanded by a young Colonel Robert E. Lee, arrived to end it. At dawn on October 18th, they stormed the building. Brown was struck down, captured, and the raid was over. 10 of his men were dead, including 2 of his sons. The rebellion had failed, but something far greater had begun. In December of 1859, John Brown was put on trial, charged with treason, murder, and inciting slave rebellion. He did not deny it. He stood before the court and spoke calmly, like a prophet addressing the ages. I believe that to have interfered as I have done, in behalf of his despised poor, I did no wrong. But right, those words, simple, fearless, unflinching, spread like wildfire. In the North, Brown was hailed as a martyr. In the South, he was condemned as a terrorist. The nation trembled. When the gallows trapdoor opened on December 2nd, John Brown's body fell, but his cause did not die with him. Ralph Waldo Emerson would later write, "John Brown will make the gallows glorious like the cross." And he was right, because within 18 months, the United States would erupt into the Civil War, the very conflict Brown had foreseen and, perhaps, set in motion. Some called him mad, some called him holy, but history rarely divides men so cleanly. John Brown's raid failed in the moment, but succeeded in awakening a nation. He forced America to face its deepest hypocrisy, that the land of liberty was built on the backs of the enslaved. And though his hands were stained with blood, his legacy was written not in defeat, but in fire. When the sun rose over Harper's Ferry that October morning, the smoke had cleared. But the storm was only beginning, because from that small brick fort, the echoes of revolution had already begun to spread all the way to Gettysburg and beyond. Number 3, World Anesthesia Day, 1846. The day surgery changed forever. October 16th, 1846. Inside the Massachusetts General Hospital in Boston, a small crowd gathers in an amphitheater bathed in morning light. Doctors in black coats whisper among themselves. Medical students crane their necks for a better view. At the center of the room, a wooden operating table, a patient trembling in fear, and a young dentist named William T.G. Morton clutching a glass inhaler. He takes a deep breath. This is the moment that will redefine human pain. The theater of fear. Before this day, surgery was horror. Every cut was agony. Every scream echoed through the halls of hospitals, reminders that medicine could heal the body, but not the pain. Operations were swift, brutal affairs. Amputation without anesthesia, childbirth without relief, dentistry that drew blood and tears in equal measure. Even the best surgeons were judged not by precision, but by speed. Because the faster you could finish, the less time your patient suffered. But on this October morning, everything was about to change. The man with the ether. William T.G. Morton was not a famous man, just a Boston dentist chasing an impossible dream, to silence pain itself. He had spent months experimenting with different chemicals, seeking one that could dull sensation without killing the patient. His choice? A simple colorless vapor, ether. It had been used in parties as a harmless curiosity, People inhaled it for a few moments of dizziness and laughter. But Morton saw something more, a gateway to a world where pain no longer ruled surgery. The experiment. The patient was Edward Abbott, a young man with a tumor in his neck. He lay motionless, terrified, as Morton approached with a sponge soaked in ether. The audience held its breath. Morton placed the device over Abbott's mouth and waited. Seconds turned into minutes. Then, silence. The man's eyes closed. His breathing slowed. He was asleep. Surgeon Dr. John Collins Warren stepped forward, knife in hand. He cut into the patient's neck. No scream. No movement. For the first time in human history, a man was operated on without pain. When the surgery ended, Warren turned to the audience, astonished. He raised his scalpel and declared, "Gentlemen, this is no humbug." The room erupted in applause. Medicine had crossed a threshold. The dawn of modern surgery news of Morton's demonstration spread like wildfire. Within weeks, ether was being used in hospitals across America and Europe. It was the beginning of modern anesthesia, a discovery that would save countless lives and transform every corner of medicine. But with triumph came turmoil. Credit for the discovery became a battlefield. Other doctors, including Crawford Long and Horace Wells, claimed they had used ether earlier. The scientific world argued for years over who deserved the glory. But history remembers the date, October 16, 1846, as the moment humanity finally conquered the tyranny of pain. A legacy in silence. Morton's life after that day was not easy. He spent years trying to secure recognition. His finances are crumbling. His health is failing. Yet, even as he faded into obscurity, his legacy endured every time a patient closed their eyes under anesthesia. That quiet moment before surgery, that stillness, is a monument to William Morton's courage. A world without fear. It's hard to imagine now, but before ether, the idea of pain-free surgery was fantasy. One simple chemical changed that, and with it, changed the meaning of compassion in medicine. Morton's demonstration didn't just prove a theory. It gave hope that science could make suffering optional, from childbirth to open-heart surgery, from battlefield medicine to modern dentistry. That single inhaler in 1846 still whispers through history. No humbug, only healing. And so, on this October 16th, the human race took a deep breath and exhaled pain into the past. Number 4, Partition of Bengal, 1905, the division that awoke a nation. Soundscape, gentle Indian sitar fades in, blended with the murmur of colonial streets, horses, vendors, and the hum of a crowded Calcutta morning. October 16th, 1905, a date that would carve deep lines across the map of India, and even deeper across the hearts of its people. It began, like all empires do, with a decision made in an office thousands of miles away. A decision justified with numbers, but one that ignored souls. On that day, the British Raj divided Bengal, one of India's largest and most influential provinces. Officially, it was for administrative efficiency. Unofficially, it was something far more deliberate, a strategy to divide a people who were growing too united. The jewel of the Rajah at the turn of the 20th century, Bengal was the intellectual and cultural heartbeat of India. It was home to poets, reformers, philosophers, and revolutionaries. Kolkata, then Calcutta, was the capital of British India, a city pulsing with energy and awakening nationalism. But to the British administration, Bengal had become too large to govern, a justification that masked an uncomfortable truth, that the unity of its educated elite posed a growing challenge to imperial authority. So, they decided to divide it, not by geography, but by identity, a map torn apart. The man behind the move was Lord Curzon, the Viceroy of India, a sharp, ambitious administrator with a cold sense of order. His plan was to split Bengal into two parts, East Bengal and Assam, with a Muslim majority, and West Bengal, with a Hindu majority. On paper, it looked like progress, smaller provinces, better governance. But on the ground, it was a wound, because for millions of Bengalis, religion was never what defined them. Language, culture, and history did, and now that shared identity had been sliced by imperial hands. Sound of a quill scratching across parchment, followed by the rip of paper. symbolizing the partition decree being signed. The day the nation wept. October 16, 1905, the day the partition took effect. In Calcutta, shops closed in mourning. Rivers were filled with thousands performing ritual baths, not in celebration but in grief. Men and women tied rocky threads on each other's wrists, a sacred symbol of unity that transcended religion. It was their silent vow that no decree, no border could divide their brotherhood. For the first time, a colonial policy had sparked something unintended, a shared resistance. A whisper that would soon become a roar. The birth of Swadeshi. From grief rose defiance. The Swadeshi movement was born, a call to boycott British goods and revive Indian industry. Students took to the streets. Traders burned foreign cloth. Writers and poets, like Rabindranath Tagore, turned art into protest, singing songs of self-reliance, pride, and freedom. "Let Bengal be one," Tagore wrote, and his words became the anthem of a generation that had found its voice. For the first time, nationalism was not confined to elites or politicians. It had become personal, woven into the fabric of daily life, from the cotton on people's backs to the ink on their letters. A Nation Awakes, narrator. The Partition of Bengal didn't just divide a province. It united a people. It turned whispers into movements, movements into revolutions. The Swadeshi cry of 1905 would echo through history, in Gandhi's non-cooperation movement, in Nehru's tryst with destiny, in every freedom struggle that followed. Lord Curzon's divide and rule policy had failed to break India's spirit. Instead, it exposed the fragility of empire and the unbreakable strength of unity, the unraveling of the divide. The protests grew too strong to ignore. By 1911, just 6 years later, the British were forced to reunite Bengal. Calcutta lost its capital status. Delhi became the new administrative seat. But Bengal, once again, was whole. The victory wasn't just political. It was emotional. It proved that collective voice could overturn imperial will. The people had tasted power, not of weapons, but of unity. Soft instrumental swells, flute and tabla blend in harmony, symbolizing cultural balance restored. The echo that still remains, more than a century later, the memory of that day still lingers. Borders have changed, nations have formed, but the story of Bengal's partition in 1905 reminds us of something timeless, that freedom isn't always won in battles. Sometimes, it's preserved in the act of standing together. October 16, 1905 wasn't just a day of division. It was the dawn of awakening, the moment when a colonized people realized that unity could shake empires. And from that day forward, India never slept again. Number 5. Marie Antoinette executed, 1793. The fall of a queen. October 16, 1793. Paris awoke to the sound of wheels creaking over whetstones, a wooden cart, carrying a queen toward her end, Marie Antoinette. Once adored, now despised. Once draped in silk, now clothed in plain white. The last queen of France, riding toward the guillotine. This was no ordinary execution. It was the symbolic unmaking of an age, a moment when monarchy and myth were stripped bare before the eyes of the world. The gilded cage. To understand her fall, we must begin with her illusion. Born an Austrian archduchess, Marie Antoinette was only 14 when she was married off to the French Dauphin, the future King Louis XVI, as a political alliance between empires. She was beautiful, naive and utterly unprepared for the theater of Versailles, a palace of gold, mirrors, and eyes that never stopped watching. Every step she took, every smile, every whisper, judged, copied, or criticized. But she was more than a girl lost in grandeur. She was a product of her time, a time when monarchy existed not as power, but as performance. Her only mistake was believing that performance would always protect her. As France's treasury crumbled under war and debt, Versailles glittered brighter than ever, and the people needed someone to blame. They found her. "She spends while we starve," they whispered. They called her Madame Deficit. The rumors grew grotesque. Diamond necklaces, secret lovers, masked balls. It didn't matter whether any of it was true. In the court of public opinion, she was already guilty. Because Marie Antoinette had become something larger than herself, a symbol of everything France hated about privilege. A face for the faceless rage of revolution. October 1789, a sea of women, furious and starving, marched from Paris to Versailles. They demanded bread, justice, and the king's presence in the capital. The palace that once seemed untouchable was suddenly surrounded by thousands. The queen's guards were slaughtered. Her family was forced from their gilded cage to live under watch in Paris. That day, the revolution wasn't just at the gates, it was inside the palace. And the queen, who once hosted balls and masquerades, now lived behind barred windows. 4 years later, the monarchy had fallen. The king was executed in January 1793. Now it was her turn. Dragged before the Revolutionary Tribunal, Marie Antoinette faced charges of treason, conspiracy, even crimes against her own children. The trial was brutal and deeply personal. In the crowded courtroom, she stood calm, pale, exhausted, but defiant. When accused of unspeakable acts, she raised her head and said softly, "I appeal to all mothers." For a brief moment, even her enemies were silent, but mercy had no place in the revolution's theater of vengeance. She was sentenced to death, October 16th, 1793, dawn. She dressed in white, the color of mourning in France. No jewels, no crown, only dignity. As she was led through the streets, crowds jeered. Yet some watched in silence, not seeing a queen, but a woman walking with extraordinary calm toward her fate. She tripped once on the scaffold step, turned to the executioner and whispered, "Pardon me, sir. I did not do it on purpose." Those were her last words. A moment later, the blade fell, and with it an era ended. Death did not silence her. It immortalized her for decades. Writers and artists would reshape her image. The spoiled queen, the innocent victim, the tragic heroine. But the truth lies somewhere between the silk and the scaffold. Marie Antoinette was not a monster, nor a saint. She was a woman born into power, destroyed by history, and misunderstood by time. Her death was meant to kill the monarchy. Instead, it created a legend. The square where she died, the Place de la Révolution, would later be renamed the Place de la Concorde, the Square of Peace, an irony she might have smiled at. Today, her name evokes both fascination and sadness, because Marie Antoinette wasn't just the last queen of France, she was the first modern celebrity. Loved, hated, watched, her every move amplified, distorted, and judged by millions. Sound familiar? It should, because in her reflection we still see ourselves, our obsession with image, spectacle, and downfall. On October 16th, 1793, a crown fell. But the story of Marie Antoinette rose higher than it ever had before. Her life ended in silence, but her myth still whispers through history. Number 6. The Cuban Missile Crisis begins, 1962. The 13 days that nearly ended the world, October 16th, 1962. A morning like any other in Washington, D.C., but in the Oval Office, a quiet storm was forming, one that would bring the world closer to nuclear war than ever before. A photograph sat on President John F. Kennedy's desk, black and white, taken by a U-2 spy plane. On it, unmistakable shapes, long, narrow, and deadly, Soviet nuclear missiles, in Cuba. Just 90 miles from the shores of the United States, this was the beginning of the Cuban Missile Crisis. 13 days that would test not just nations, but the very limits of human judgment. Shadows of fear. The early 1960s were an age of paranoia wrapped in progress. The Cold War had split the world in two. Democracy and communism locked in an ideological duel, both armed with enough firepower to end humanity 100 times over. To Americans, Cuba was no longer just a tropical island. It was a symbol of defiance, danger, and betrayal. In 1959, Fidel Castro's revolution had overthrown the US-backed Batista regime. By 1961, Cuba had aligned with the Soviet Union. And when the US failed to overthrow Castro in the Bay of Pigs invasion, the stage was set for revenge. For Premier Nikita Khrushchev, placing missiles in Cuba wasn't just strategy, it was balance, a way to match America's nuclear presence in Turkey and Italy. But the risk? Catastrophic. The moment of discovery. The discovery came from the skies. A U-2 reconnaissance plane flying over western Cuba on October 14th captured images that changed history. 2 days later, the photographs reached the White House. When analysts confirmed what they showed, medium and intermediate-range nuclear missiles under construction, the room fell silent. Kennedy's advisors, the Executive Committee of the National Security Council, or EXCOM, convened in secrecy. What followed was not just a meeting of minds, but of fears: attack or negotiate, show strength or seek peace. Each option carried the shadow of annihilation. The brink of decision, Kennedy knew he was walking a tightrope. An airstrike could destroy the missiles, but it would also kill Soviet soldiers. That could ignite a global nuclear war. In one tense recording from those meetings, Kennedy's brother Robert says softly, "If we attack Cuba, they'll attack Berlin. Then we're in a war that'll never end." It was a chessboard, and every move risked checkmate for humanity. After sleepless deliberation, Kennedy made his choice. He would impose a naval quarantine, a blockade, around Cuba. Not an invasion, but a line in the ocean. It was the middle ground between action and apocalypse. The blockade begins October 22, 1962. The world held its breath. At 7 p.m., Kennedy appeared on television, calm, composed, but grave. He told the American people the truth. Soviet nuclear missiles had been found in Cuba, and the U.S. would not tolerate them. His words echoed around the globe. For the first time, ordinary citizens realized how close they stood to the edge. Families built shelters. Children practiced duck and cover drills. Newspapers printed maps showing which cities might vanish in the first hour of nuclear war. The fear was real, tangible, and yet life went on. People still went to work, still laughed, still hoped. The world holds its breath. Days turned to nights and the tension grew unbearable. American warships patrolled the blockade line. Soviet vessels steamed toward it. Every hour that passed felt like a countdown to the end of civilization. Then, on October 24th, a Soviet ship approached the blockade. The order was clear. If it crossed, American forces would act. But at the last moment, it stopped. The world exhaled. For now. Behind the scenes, letters flew between Kennedy and Khrushchev, one desperate, one defiant. Back channels opened. Mistrust deepened, and somewhere between pride and fear came the first flicker of understanding, the deal that saved the world. By October 27th, Black Saturday they called it, the world stood seconds from disaster. A U.S. spy plane was shot down over Cuba. Advisors demanded retaliation. Kennedy refused. He knew one rash act could doom millions. Instead, he offered a deal. Publicly, the Soviets would withdraw their missiles from Cuba. Privately, the U.S. would remove its own missiles from Turkey and Italy. But months later, quietly, Khrushchev accepted. And on October 28, 1962, the missiles began to roll back. The crisis was over. The world had survived. The lesson of fear. In those 13 days, humanity had looked into the abyss and stepped back. Kennedy emerged a hero, Khrushchev humiliated, but both forever changed. The red telephone hotline between Moscow and Washington was created soon after, so that no misunderstanding could ever bring the world so close again. But the real victory wasn't political. It was human. In the face of fear, they chose restraint. In a century defined by power, they remembered humility. October 16, 1962, the day fear became wisdom. And history held its breath, so the future. Number 7, China's first nuclear test, 1964. The day the balance of power shifted. October 16, 1964. In the desolate expanse of China's Lop Nur Desert, the air was still, silent, and waiting. At exactly 3 p.m. local time, a flash, brighter than the sun, a shockwave rolling across miles of sand and salt. That was the moment China entered the nuclear age. And the balance of world power shifted forever. The seeds of a revolution. The story begins long before that detonation. China, emerging from civil war in 1949, was a wounded nation. Poor, fractured, and struggling to rebuild under its new leader, Mao Zedong. To many outside observers, China was a giant asleep. But Mao had a dream, to awaken it and make the world take notice. The early years of the People's Republic were marked by both triumph and tragedy. The Great Leap Forward sought to industrialize China overnight, but left millions starving. The nation's pride was bruised, its ambitions doubted. And so in the 1950s, when the Soviet Union offered nuclear cooperation, Mao saw an opportunity. A chance to give China what it lacked: power, deterrence, respect. But like all alliances in the Cold War, this one would not last. Betrayal and determination. By 1960, tensions between Beijing and Moscow had erupted. Ideological fractures, political pride, and a rivalry for leadership of the communist world. The Soviets withdrew their scientists, blueprints, and support. They left China's nuclear program stranded, but rather than surrender, China doubled down. Its scientists, working under primitive conditions, in secrecy and isolation, pressed forward. There were no supercomputers, no Western funding, only determination. And fear. They called it Project 596. The numbers, a reference to June 1959, when Mao first decided that China must build the bomb, no matter the cost. Building the bomb, deep in the Gobi Desert, a hidden city rose, a place known only as Base 21. Tens of thousands of workers labored in silence, digging tunnels, assembling reactors, and refining uranium. They lived in secrecy. Many didn't even know what they were building, but among them, one man did, physicist Chen Sun-kyung, often called the father of China's atomic bomb. He had studied in France before World War II and returned home with both knowledge and conviction. To him, this was more than science. It was survival, because in the nuclear world, power wasn't shared. It was taken. The day of the test, October 16, 1964. The desert wind was cold that morning. At Lop Nur, a simple tower rose above the barren earth. At its top, a sphere roughly the size of a car, filled with uranium-235. Scientists and military observers stood miles away in bunkers, their faces lit by tension and disbelief. At 3:00 p.m., a coded signal was sent. The world's silence was broken by a roar that could be heard for hundreds of miles. The explosion bloomed upward, a golden fireball rising into a mushroom cloud nearly 10 kilometers high. In that moment, China became the world's fifth nuclear power, and the global order shifted. The shockwave across the world news of the detonation raced across the globe. In Washington, analysts watched in disbelief. In Moscow, unease turned to caution. In Tokyo and Delhi, fear. For the West, this was not just another test. It was a message. China was no longer a secondary power. It was now a force that demanded to be heard. Yet the world's response was not celebration, it was anxiety. Because every new bomb meant another piece of the world's safety shattered. But for China, it was vindication. Years of hardship, isolation, and mockery, now silenced by one blinding flash: the meaning of power. Mao Zedong once said, "The atomic bomb is a paper tiger. It looks fierce, but it can be overcome." Yet when China detonated its own, that tiger had teeth. To the Chinese people, it was a moment of pride, a symbol that their nation had risen from humiliation to command respect. To the world, it was a reminder power was no longer the privilege of a few. The atomic age now had a new voice, and it spoke Mandarin. The legacy of Lop Nur. Over the next decades, China would refine and expand its nuclear arsenal, but always with a sense of restraint. Unlike the arms races of the US and Soviet Union, China maintained a doctrine of no first use. The Lop Nur test site became a symbol of ambition, defiance, and destiny. And while the desert still bears the scars of that explosion, its echo remains a quiet lesson. That power, once unleashed, cannot be undone, but it can be controlled. October 16, 1964, the day the dragon found its fire, and the world felt its. Number 8. The Long March begins, 1934, the road that forged a revolution. October 16, 1934. A cold dawn rises over the small town of Yudu, in southern China's Jiangxi province. Tens of thousands of soldiers stand in formation, tired, hungry, but resolute. Before them stretches a journey that will take them through mountains, rivers, snow, and death. A journey of nearly 6,000 miles. This is where the Long March begins. A retreat that would become legend. A march not of defeat, but rebirth, the fall of the Red Stronghold. By 1934, the Chinese Communist Party was under siege. Surrounded by Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist forces, their stronghold in Jiangxi, the heart of the Red Movement, was collapsing. The enemy's encirclement strategy was relentless. City by city, outpost by outpost, the Red Army was being strangled. Mao Zedong and Zhou Enlai faced a terrible choice: stay and be crushed, or leave and gamble everything on survival. And so on that October morning, the decision was made not to break free. To march north across a hostile China to find a new base. It wasn't a retreat. It was a resurrection in motion, a river of men and dreams. The Long March was not one single army, but a river of humanity, 86,000 men and women moving across rivers, forests, and battlefields. They carried rifles, supplies, and flags. Some carried children. Others carried the wounded. They were chased, bombed, and starved. But they kept marching, through mud that swallowed boots, through rain that erased trails, through mountains so steep that even horses refused to climb. Each night, they built fires that lit up the valleys, tiny sparks against an ocean of darkness, and with every mile, the weak fell away. The strong endured. The idea survived. Mao's rise and the turning point. In the early months of the march, leadership was divided and morale was low. But in January 1935, during a fateful meeting in Zunyi, everything changed. Mao Zedong, once sidelined, rose to prominence. His strategies, guerrilla warfare, mobility, survival, had proven right. And now, the movement was his to lead. Under Mao's vision, the Red Army stopped running aimlessly. They began to move with purpose, avoiding battles they couldn't win, striking when the enemy least expected it. This was not just the survival of an army, it was the birth of a revolution's leader, the trials of the land. They crossed the Xiang River, where thousands were lost to gunfire and drowning. They trekked through the snow-covered peaks of Sichuan, where frostbite claimed fingers and lives. They crossed the grasslands of Aba, a vast green swamp stretching to the horizon. Beautiful from afar, deadly up close. Men sank into mud that swallowed them whole. Food ran out. Some boiled leather to survive, but they kept moving, guided by belief more than by maps. Out of 86,000 who began the march, less than 8,000 would reach the end. Yet every step carried the heartbeat of an idea, that someday a new China would rise, the human spirit beyond politics. The Long March was not only a military event, it was a human story of endurance, sacrifice, and faith. Along the way, the Red Army crossed lands of dozens of ethnic groups, sharing food with villagers, helping farmers rebuild homes, earning trust and a place in their hearts. They wrote songs of courage, painted banners of hope, and whispered dreams of equality under the stars. They were not yet victors, but they were no longer victims. They had become symbols of resistance and destiny. The arrival at Yan'an, a year later. In October 1935, the survivors reached Yan'an, in the northern province of Shanxi, barefoot, battle-worn, and broken, but alive. They had walked through the impossible and made it history. Yan'an became the new revolutionary base, the cradle of Mao's power, and the heart of a movement that would one day reshape the world. The march that began as a desperate escape ended as a defining chapter in modern China's story. The meaning of the march narrator: soft, reflective. The Long March was more than a journey through mountains and rivers. It was a journey through belief. It proved that ideas can outlast armies, that endurance can triumph over despair, and that even in the darkest hour, a dream can march on. Today, in Chinese history, the Long March stands not as a tale of retreat, but as a monument to persistence. It is remembered not for where it began or ended, but for how it was walked, step by step against all odds. October 16th, 1934, the day a march began that would never truly end. Because some journey. Number 9. Desmond Tutu wins the Nobel Peace Prize, 1984. The Voice That Moved a Nation, October 16th, 1984. A chill morning in Oslo, Norway, inside the Grand Hall of the Nobel Institute. A small man in clerical robes steps forward to the podium, smiling gently. his eyes gleaming with both kindness and fire. His name, Archbishop Desmond Tutu. That day, the world honors not just a man of faith, but a man of courage. A voice that refused to be silenced in the face of oppression. A soul that believed peace could bloom even in the darkest soil, and as his name echoes through the chamber, millions in South Africa, still shackled by apartheid, feel, perhaps for the first time, that hope has a heartbeat. The world that needed a hero narrator. To understand why Desmond Tutu's victory mattered, we must first see the world he was born into, South Africa in the 20th century, a land rich in gold, diamonds, and soil, but poisoned by segregation, apartheid, a cold, calculated system that divided an entire nation by the color of skin. White minority rule dictated where people could live, who they could marry, what jobs they could hold, and even which benches they could sit on. Millions were forced into poverty and silence, and speaking against it meant imprisonment, or worse. In that silence, Desmond Tutu chose to speak. A shepherd in a storm, born in 1931. The son of a teacher and a cleaner, Desmond Tutu had no army, no wealth, no political power. But he had words. And words, when spoken with faith, can move mountains. As a young priest, he saw injustice everywhere. Children beaten for crossing racial lines, families torn apart by forced relocation. So he began to preach not just sermons of heaven, but of humanity. He said, "If you are neutral in situations of injustice, you have chosen the side of the oppressor." His church became a sanctuary, not just for the faithful, but for the fearful, a place where protest songs became prayers, where tears became courage, peace in a land of violence. The 1970s and 1980s were brutal. The apartheid government tightened its grip, and protests were met with bullets. Tutu became the moral compass of a broken nation. While others called for revenge, he called for reconciliation. While others preached hate, he preached forgiveness. He led marches through tear gas and riot shields, carrying only a Bible and his faith, and when he spoke, his voice didn't just echo, it healed. In one speech he declared, "We are the rainbow people of God," a phrase that would one day become the symbol of South Africa's rebirth, the Nobel moment. So when, on October 16, 1984, the Nobel Committee announced Desmond Tutu as that year's Peace Prize laureate, it wasn't just an award, it was a roar, a message to the world that moral power could defeat military power, that peace could outshine oppression. In his acceptance speech, Tutu stood humbly, thanking not himself, but the millions of South Africans who had suffered, resisted, and still hoped. He said, "This award is for all who have no voice, but still sing." And across South Africa, from townships to cathedrals, people danced. For the first time in years, joy felt legal, beyond the prize. But the Nobel Prize was not the end of his fight. It was a torch, and he carried it through decades of transformation. When Nelson Mandela was released from prison in 1990, it was Desmond Tutu who welcomed him with tears and laughter, and after apartheid fell, it was Tutu who chaired the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, a painful but powerful process where victims and perpetrators faced one another, not to punish, but to forgive. He believed that a nation could not heal by burying its wounds. It had to face them. Together. The laughter and the light. For all his gravity, Desmond Tutu was known for his joy. He danced during sermons, laughed during interviews, and teased even presidents with the charm of a wise elder. He and Mandela shared a friendship like brothers, built on shared pain and shared purpose. He often said, "Goodness is stronger than evil. Love is stronger than hate." And in a century marked by division, he reminded the world that hope was not naive. It was necessary. A legacy that still speaks. Desmond Tutu passed away in 2021, but his laughter, his words, his unwavering faith in humanity still echo through the world. He taught us that peace isn't passive, it's a daily act of courage, that forgiveness isn't weakness, it's freedom, and that even the smallest voice, when guided by love, can change the course of nations. So on that October day in 1984, when he stood before the world, the applause wasn't just for him, it was for the light he carried. Because in every age of darkness, there comes a voice that says, "Do not give up on the human heart." And that voice. Number 10. Million Man March, 1995. A sea of brotherhood and resolve. October 16th, 1995. A crisp Monday morning in Washington. You see, the air is alive, not with protest, but with purpose. From every corner of America, from Chicago, New York, Atlanta, Detroit, they come. Young men, old men, fathers, sons, teachers, preachers, veterans, by train, by bus, by car. They converge on the National Mall, one by one, until the green fields before the Capitol turn into a living sea of faces, nearly 1 million black men standing shoulder to shoulder in one of the largest gatherings in American history. This is the Million Man March, and its heartbeat is redemption. A nation searching for itself. The early 1990s were not kind to America's inner cities. Crime rates were high. Communities were fractured. The media painted an image of black men as dangerous, irresponsible, lost. But behind that image was a deeper truth, a generation yearning for renewal, for brotherhood, for dignity. And out of that need came an idea, not of anger, but of accountability. An idea that every man could change his home, his community, and his country by first changing himself. The call that shook America. It was Nation of Islam leader Louis Farrakhan who issued the call for 1 million black men to gather peacefully in Washington. He envisioned a day not of protest, but of reflection and commitment. It was bold, controversial, and to some, impossible. How could a movement, with no political backing, no corporate sponsorship, and no mainstream media support, draw such a crowd? The answer came on October 16th. By dawn, buses lined the city streets for miles. By noon, the mall was overflowing, not with rage, but with reverence. The power of unity. Everywhere you looked, men prayed, hugged, wept, and listened. There was no violence. No looting, no confrontation, just peace. Teachers spoke to students about education. Pastors preached responsibility and love. Fathers called home to tell their children they were proud. For one day, the stereotypes were silenced, and the truth spoke louder, that the strength of a people lies not in protest alone, but in unity. Words that echoed through generations. When Louis Farrakhan finally took the stage, the crowd, stretching from the Capitol to the Washington Monument, fell into silence. His voice carried across the wind. We are gathered here, not to curse the darkness, but to light a candle. He spoke of rebuilding families, reviving faith, and reclaiming responsibility. He reminded the men that they were kings, descendants of survivors, builders of nations, bearers of greatness. It wasn't about politics. It was about promise. And though some criticized his past, that day, the message transcended the messenger. The unseen power of the day. There were no major news cameras broadcasting live. No flashy headlines celebrating the crowd. But history doesn't always need a spotlight. The power of the Million Man March was not just in its numbers. It was in its transformation. That day, millions of men pledged to mentor, to educate, to build communities, form new initiatives. Churches created youth programs. Fathers returned home. It wasn't a perfect change, but it was a spark, and sometimes that's all a movement needs. The legacy that endures. In the years that followed, the echoes of that day continued to ripple outward. Black men and women began hosting their own Days of Atonement. Schools taught the march as an example of peaceful power. And every October 16th, those who were there remember. They remember the stillness of that morning. The prayers, the tears, the pride of standing shoulder to shoulder in a country that often refused to see them. The Million Man March was not about protest signs. It was about a mirror. A nation forced to look at itself and ask, what do we stand for? Brotherhood beyond time. Today, nearly 3 decades later, the images of that day remain powerful, not of fists raised, but of hands joined, not of anger, but of grace. The Million Man March remains one of the most peaceful mass gatherings in world history, a reminder that strength isn't in how loud we shout, but how deeply we stand together. And in a world still divided by race, creed, and politics, its message endures, that unity is not found in uniformity, but in shared humanity. October 16th, 1995, a day when 1 million hearts beat as one. And for a brief shining moment, the world saw what brotherhood truly looked like. The echoes of October 16th. From a guillotine in 1793 to the birth of Disney's magic. From silent hospital chambers filled with the scent of ether to the thunder of a million voices in Washington, D.C. October 16th has always been more than just a date. It's a mirror, reflecting humanity's greatest fears, its boldest dreams, and the timeless struggle between destruction and creation. Each moment, every act of courage, discovery, and defiance reminds us that history isn't a collection of stories from the past. It's a pulse, still beating, still shaping who we are today. And if this journey through time moved you, don't let it end here. Go back one day to October 15th, where laughter changed television forever and courage shaped empires. And tomorrow, return to this very place for October 17th, where new echoes of history await, stories of genius, rebellion, and fate that time refuses to forget. If you believe history should feel alive, like the stories still breathe between the centuries, then you are already part of the sleeping historian family. So, take a moment, like this video, share it, subscribe, because every time you do, you keep the past from fading and help history wake again. Narrator, whisper soft close. Until tomorrow, sleep well, historians. The past will meet you soon.